Hello and good evening, everybody. Thank you for taking the time to join us for tonight's webinar on maximising feed intake through understanding, access and consumption. I'm delighted to welcome Professor Trevor de Vries from the Department of Animal Bioscience at the University of Guelph. Trevor's work focuses on the interaction between nutrition management and how we can improve animal performance through our better understanding of how the animal itself behaves. Trevor has kindly agreed to share his experiences with us tonight through the facilities of the webinar. So, over to you, Trevor.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much, Stephen, for the introduction. Thank you to the Agriculture and Horticulture Development Board for the invitation, particularly yourself, Stephen, as well as Jenny Gibbons and as you mentioned, Alana Arnold as well for setting up this webinar. It's a pleasure of mine to be able to share some of the research that we've done in this topic area. As you described, one of the focuses of our research program is really looking at how dairy cows behave in their environment, particularly from a feeding behavior standpoint, and use that knowledge to assess the way that we feed dairy cows from a dietary perspective as well as a management and housing perspective. And so what I want to do today is walk you through some of that data, describing how feeding behavior is important from a production standpoint and a health standpoint in dairy cows, and then give some practical, I guess, suggestions and tips of how we can take advantage of that knowledge, and then hopefully answer any questions, specific questions that I might not have covered in my presentation here. So the first thing that I want to do is really get down to understanding or answering the question why eating behavior of dairy cows is important for us to consider. At this slide here, in this figure, if we look at the amount of food an animal consumes, it's really a function of her eating behavior. So the amount of food that a dairy cow consumes is really a function of how many meals that cow has per day, as well as the size of those meals. So basically, meal size multiplied by meal frequency equals the total dry matter intake or intake level of that animal. And same thing with the time course of eating. So the amount of time the animal spends eating, as well as the rate or the speed by which the animal consumes her feed, is going to determine her overall dry matter intake level. And so if we want a dairy cow to eat more feed, we're going to have to get her to change some aspect of her behavior. Either, again, as an example, have more meals per day, larger meals per day, or some combination of those two factors. And the same thing goes with feeding time and feeding rate. So she needs to either spend more time at the feed bunk or spend more time eating, more time or eating faster, again, some combination of those two factors there. Now, what's interesting is that if we think of what's more important for the cow, we've actually done some digging there, and in some of the data that we've collected over the last few years and a number of studies that we've done where we've been able to measure individual intake levels of cows as well as different aspects of their feeding behavior. And what we found is that when we try to associate intake, or in this case dry matter intake, with eating behavior, the two most consistent eating factors that we've been able to associate are feeding time and meal frequency. So the amount of time the animal spends at the feed bunk, as well as the number of meals, so the kind of the congregated visits that animal has in any given day. And you can see in this figure here an example of that, where we see this positive relationship. Now, it's not very steep, but basically the cows that spend more time feeding per day, so basically as they spend more time at the feed bunk per day eating their feed, and in this case, in these studies, these are all mixed feeds, so a total mixed ration, we see that those cows then also have the highest dry matter intake level. Now, again, it's not very steep, but what this does tell us that if we're trying to maximize that intake level in our cows, we need to provide them with every opportunity to also then maximize the amount of time that they're spending eating at the feed bunk. And the same thing goes with meal frequency. So having multiple meals per day rather than smaller, less frequent meals, large individual meals across the day, intake seems to be better correlated with animals that have very frequent meals, smaller meals across the day. What's also interesting about these two things is that not only are those two factors and those two aspects of eating behavior associated with intake level, but they're also associated with the rumen itself and how the rumen of the cow, so that chamber doing all that fermentation for the cow over feed, the stability of that rumen environment is going to be dictated somewhat by how consistent and how that cow actually consumes her feed across the day. And so we know that if cows consume their feed in very large, quick meals, we might have heard the term slug feeding before. When cows consume a very large meal very quickly, what that does is that throws the rumen environment off, creating kind of these within-day plunges in terms of acid production, the pH drops, and we increase the risk of things like subacute ruminal acidosis occurring in the cow's rumen. And the more that happens, the less digestive or less efficient, the digestive process is in the cow. And we also run the risk of things like milk fat depression. So butterfat drops in dairy cows are often associated with a disruption to that normal rumen environment, which again can be related to the type of feed obviously consumed, but if that type is very fermentable, if it's grain or a mixed ration with a large portion of grain, the bigger the meal the animal has and the less frequent those are and the faster they're consumed, the worse off it's going to be for the cow. Alternatively, if we can get that cow to stretch out her eating behavior, spread those meals, smaller meals more frequently throughout the day, we're going to see a much more consistent eating pattern and a much more stable rumen environment for those cows. And the end result of that is cows actually being more productive at the end of the day. So this is again some data which you see on your screen here, or I've taken from one of our studies where we simply looked at how many meals cows are having per day, and these are all cows consuming about the same level of dry matter intake or feed consumption. And so what this means is that cows that are having more frequent meals per day, so if we move to the right here, those cows that have the most frequent meals per day, also the smaller meals per day, they're the ones that have the highest milk fat content. And so again, it's that stabilizing of the rumen environment, which is translating into, in this case, improved milk fat production in those cows. And because of that stabilization effect, as well as the impact of meal frequency, say on total intake level, it's not that surprising that we also see that those cows that have more frequent, smaller meals also having the highest milk production. And so this is again from that same study where again I've taken the meal frequency here of the cows and associated that in this case with milk yield. In this case it's 4% fat corrected milk yield in kilograms per day. And so these are all fairly productive cows, and we see again not a perfect relationship, but in general the trend line here, what it tells us is that there's this positive association where our highest producing cows tend to be the ones that also have the most frequent meals per day. And so then that forces us to think again about what are factors that are going to influence that meal patterning in those cows. In addition to the time course of eating and say the size of meals that cows have, the other thing that we need to consider is the composition of the feed that the cow actually consumes. And so we spend a fair amount of time watching cows eat, and it's really not just how she eats, but it's also what she eats. And as I hope you can see on your screen, I've got a picture here with her tongue stretched way out, trying to lick up whatever little particle that's on the floor of the barn. And if you've ever watched dairy cows eat particularly a mixed ration, but even grazing on pasture, what you'll see them do is be quite selective in terms of what they consume given the feed that's available to them. And this is particularly problematic when we provide mixed rations in a barn environment. And despite our best efforts in terms of blending everything up very well, the cow still really is going to have certain components of the diet that she prefers to eat, and is going to do that. And the issue with that is at the end of the day, the cow ends up consuming a diet that is really different from what we originally intended her to consume. We put all this time and effort, and I say we, it's actually you as the producer, puts a lot of time and effort into making sure that that diet's balanced. You've got good feeds, you've consulted a nutritionist to put together the best diet for your animals, and then we put it in front of the animals. But if the animals don't consume it as we've intended it to, then all that hard work is kind of being thrown out. And we see that. So cows will typically, when we give them particularly a mixed ration with forages and concentrates and grains, is that we'll see them selecting against the longer forage particles and sorting for the grain. And really, again, that can have two effects on the cow. Is number one, it's going to throw off that balance, so the balance need to optimize production for that individual cow. And then also it's going to create variability at a herd level in a group housing situation in terms of what everybody else consumes of that feed as well. And I just wanted to show you, because we've got some really neat data from studies that we've conducted where we're actually able to see some of these associations. And so just on your screen here, what you have here is some data from a study that we did quite recently, where we looked at how much sorting cows were doing of their diet. And in this case, when I say sorting, we're looking at the long forage particles, so the long hay and haylage, and in our case, corn silage particles that sit on the top screen of a particle shaker box that looks just something like this, so the screen here. And what we found is that the more sorting that cows do against those particles, so the more they select against those particles that sit on top of this screen here, this shaker box, the lower their milk components are. And again, with milk fat, I think that's quite predictable. You see here on the top left corner here, basically those cows, as we move from right to left in this case, as we move from those cows with high milk fat down to lower milk fat, what we see is that their sorting basically against those long particles increases. And I'll explain this axis here. What this means is 100% basically means that they're eating the diet exactly as we predict them to consume. And as we move basically down from this 100% down into 80, 60%, that means that those animals are consuming like 20 to 40% less of those long particles than what we predict. And again, we know those long particles are good for the rumen environment. Those long forage particles are good for stimulating rumination, for stimulating chewing and saliva production, all things that are going to keep that rumen environment stable. And so it's not too surprising that we see, again, in this situation, that those cows that are doing more sorting are experiencing lower milk fat percentages. Interestingly, in this study, we also saw a very similar association with milk protein percentage. And again, I think this relates to the fact that if cows sort their diet, what happens is that you end up with cows consuming a diet that's really not balanced for the production that we intend for her. So again, those cows that are sorting more against the long particles, as well as sorting for the other bits and pieces of those diets, the more they do that, the less likely that they're going to consume that diet as intended, and again, they're going to be less able to optimize their milk components. As I mentioned before, this isn't just an individual cow problem. This can be a herd problem, and so in a survey of Canadian herds that we did a couple of years ago, part of a study we did, we actually looked at how groups of cows on Canadian farms sorted their feed, and then correlated that or associated that with production characteristics on those farms. And what we found is that in those farms that we studied, every 2% refusal of long particles, so again, those, as I showed you in the last slide, those particles that sit on top of that particle shaker box, every 2% refusal of those at a herd level was associated with about a 0.9 kilogram difference in fat-corrected milk, and a 2% decrease in production efficiency on those farms. And so what that meant is that I had farms in this study that either their cows did very little sorting to no sorting, up to about 10% refusal of those long particles. And so when controlling for everything else, we could predict about a 4.5 kilogram or about a 10-pound difference in milk production on a per cow basis, again, averaged at a herd level, based on just on how much sorting those cows were doing in those herds. So very significant impact on overall production level. Like it's very difficult for us to change herd production just based on even small dietary changes, let alone in this case, this is just simply the cow behavior having a huge significant impact on herd level production. So with that kind of knowledge base, the question then becomes for us is how do we actually take this forward, and what does it mean from a feeding management standpoint? And really, I have two take-home messages. One is that we want to ensure that dairy cows are first and foremost stimulated to access feed throughout their day. And what that means is that what that's going to do is that if cows are stimulated to access their feed throughout the day, they're going to want to go feed at various intervals throughout the day, conducive to, again, spending much time feeding, slowing down their rate of intake, having smaller, more frequent meals. All these things that we mentioned earlier are going to be good from a rumen health and from an intake standpoint. And then the other point there is just as important, is that whenever they do go feed, that they actually have access to the ration formulated for them. And so what that means is that any time point that a dairy cow gets up and wants to go feed, that the feed that's available to them is really what we've intended her to eat. So again, not sorted through, not picked through, and it's actually available to her, and that she can gain access to it. So what I want to do is walk you just through a couple examples of management things which are going to influence these factors. So the first question that I want to answer or think about or get you to think about specifically is, how do we stimulate cows to access their feed throughout the day? And we need to think about, okay, what are the factors then that drive dairy cows or get them up to feed? And we know that if we keep cows in a natural environment, say a grazing pasture environment, and many of you might do that, what we see in that environment is the eating behavior patterns of dairy cows are often largely dictated by time of day. So for a grazing animal, we'll see the majority of their eating bouts clustered kind of in the morning and afternoon, with lesser activity throughout the middle of the day, and then very little activity over the nighttime period. And this is a very well established eating pattern in any ruminant, whether that be dairy cattle or beef cattle, or even small ruminants like sheep and goats. But what we know is that when we move that eating environment to that dairy cow inside, so in more intensive situations in our dairy barns, where we might be feeding them more intensely as well, feeding them mixed rations or even individual components in those formats, we know that the stimulation to eat changes. It's no longer simply dictated by time of day. We know that management events such as milking and feed delivery then become actually the largest determinants on when dairy cows consume their feed throughout the day. And we've done a series of studies on these over the last 10 years or so, where we've got pretty good evidence that in those circumstances, the single and most consistent driver for dairy cows in terms of getting them up and stimulating them to eat is really and simply the delivery of new feed. And while those other factors like time of day, like milking itself, can stimulate cows, we know that getting new feed in front of cows is going to be the single biggest stimulant for those animals in terms of getting them up and getting them to the feed bunk. And so thinking of that and knowing that knowledge, we then know that if we can get feed more often in front of cows and we can drop feed more often across the day, we're going to see an impact on the eating behavior patterns of dairy cows. And again, we've done a number of studies over the years where we've looked at feeding cows, again, a conserved ration, a mixed ration, one time a day or more often. And what we find is that the more often that feed gets dropped in front of the cows, what we see is basically the eating patterns of those cows get leveled off across the day. And just one example of that here is in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen here. We had a study where we fed cows twice a day or 4 times a day. And so the blue line here is cows that are fed twice a day in the morning and again in the afternoon. And you see a distinctive eating pattern. When in the green line now, we feed 4 times a day, we see these additional spikes in eating behavior across the day. And that really corresponds to these cows having more frequent, smaller, kind of more consistent meals across the day. All these things that we described earlier as being good for the cow in terms of spreading out her intake. At the same time, we also know that by delivering feed more often, we also spread out the time allotment that cows have access to individual batches of feed. And what that means is that it becomes more difficult for cows to sort their feed as much across the day as well. And so this is just an example of that here, where we look at feed that was sampled in the feed bunk across the day for groups of cows that were either fed 1 time a day in the red diamond shapes or twice a day in the blue squares. And what you see is a subtle difference, particularly late in the day, where in this case, the NDF, which is the fiber content of the feed, increases much more rapidly for those cows fed once a day, indicating that they're doing much more sorting of their diet across the day. And again, what this means is that if we can keep this diet more consistent across the day, we're going to reduce that variability in terms of what cows actually consume, not only within individual cows, but particularly between cows. And so what this translates into, or should translate into, again, is more consistency in terms of production as well. And I got a really neat example of some data here on the screen. This is from some researchers in the United States in Pennsylvania State University. And what they did was they compared cows that were fed, in this case, 1 times per day, or in the solid line, or 4 times per day in the dotted line. And what you see is when they looked at milk fat percent, they actually measured milk fat 4 times a day. They milked cows 4 times a day as part of this study. And they found that in 3 of the cases where you see these stars above the lines here, these were significant increases in the amount of milk fat that those cows are producing, which here in the morning was about a 0.45 percentage point increase, and in the afternoon or late afternoon and evening, they saw about a 0.22 increase in milk fat in those cows that were fed more often. So again, this is really mediated through those cows having more frequent meals, smaller meals across the day, leveling off that rumen environment. And we see, in this case, an improvement, a simple way actually of improving milk fat in these cows, just simply by getting them to eat more often. Some of you might ask the question, well, does this improve the amount of feed that the animal actually consumes? And this is where some of the data is a little less consistent. Some studies would tell us that, yes, cows will eat more when we feed them more often, and there's other studies to suggest that they necessarily won't eat more, but rather we'll just see this leveling effect or consistency effect in terms of when they're consuming their feed. Now, my recommendation, I guess, is to watch what happens. Just because you don't see cows eat more feed, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's not having a benefit to those cows. But we do need to think about when we actually provide feed to cows, and that's what I wanted to actually show with the data that you see on your screen here. We did a study where we fed cows once, twice, or 3 times a day. And so they had either their single feeding here, or they had 2 feedings here and here, or they had 3 feedings across the day. And what you see is that as we added more feedings, and what this is the amount of food the animals consume on an individual basis per hour, we see a little bit more feed consumed at each of these kind of time points of the day when we added feed delivery. And so what this translated into in the study was a higher level of total dry matter intake when these cows were fed more often. The issue that we see in this study is that these are the time periods when cows are also milked across the day. So these cows were milked 3 times a day. And so all we did in this circumstance was actually increase the size of the meals that the cows were consuming at those individual time points, which again is not something we want to encourage from an eating behavior standpoint. We'd actually rather try spread out those eating events and get them to be a little bit more consistent across the day. So this is something that we've actually looked at as well, just for interest's sake, is actually thinking about what are opportunities for us then to try create more points of stimulation or more time points across the day when we can stimulate cows to get up and go to the feed bunk. We know that delivery of feed is going to stimulate cows to feed. We also know that time of day is going to have an influence, and also milking well. So if we stagger those events across the day, can we actually get cows to show kind of more consistent and improved eating patterns? And so this is actually something we did in a study last year where we fed cows twice a day, either at milking time, so in the gray line at milking time, so we fed them here at this milking here in the morning, or sorry, in the afternoon, as well as the next morning here. And we also fed them in between milkings in the blue line. And what we see is that when we move the time of feed delivery away from milking, we actually see a little bit of a shift in their eating pattern. It's not that obvious, but what this translated in was about one increased meal per day per cow, which again, when cows are consuming only about 7 or 8 large meals per day, that's a pretty significant increase. And what we saw was that efficiency of milk production was actually improved by about 7% in this case. So we actually saw that by shifting that eating pattern over, we got those cows to actually create a more consistent eating pattern conducive to more efficient digestion in those cows. One of the questions that maybe some of you are thinking of as I'm presenting this is, well, can't we just make sure that cows are stimulated to eat in other ways, like just simply by pushing that feed closer to those cows? And that's a very valid thought and something that we definitely need to think about, because the last thing that we want is a cow, such as the one you see in the picture here, coming up to the feed bunk and really having not the feed that she wants to consume in front of her. This cow here, she wants to consume this feed that's sitting out here. She doesn't want this leftover feed that's being picked through and sorted through right here. And if we don't do this enough, if we don't push this feed back, what's going to happen is that this cow is going to come up to the feed bunk. She might stand around and wait and again waste her time in effect, or she might go lie down, and in that case we've kind of missed an eating opportunity in that cow. So we might be again sacrificing total dry matter intake for that cow, or we might be again causing cows to have inefficient patterns of intake as well. So the more often that we can get that feed pushed up to those cows across the day, the more beneficial it's going to be from that standpoint of ensuring that whenever that cow does get up and go to the feed bunk, that there is really feed available to her and within her reach. The question that you might ask is, can we just do that simply instead of getting feed in front of cows more often? And while pushing up feed is very important from ensuring that feed access standpoint, what we know from research is that cows do not have the same stimulation effect of having their feed pushed up in terms of getting them up and getting them to eat as, say, the delivery of new feed does. Some of you might make that argument now and say, well, whenever we've seen, or in our situation, we push up feed, all the cows get up and they all run to the feed bunk. Or I've seen that on other farms where the producer comes through and pushes up feed and all the cows come running. In that situation, what that tells me is that it's really not the fact that that feed push-up is stimulating those cows to eat, but in those cases, the cows have been without feed for too long, and it's really high time that that feed does get pushed up to actually get those cows stimulated and eating their food. If we're pushing up feed frequently enough across the day, that the active push-up itself shouldn't really be stimulating cows to get up. It should just ensure that whenever cows are up, that there is feed available to them and at the bunk. And it's really those other events that are going to have the greater impact in terms of stimulating feed consumption and getting the cows up and moving across the day, as you kind of see in this figure here, where the percentage of cows feeding is more largely dictated by those events of milking and feed delivery than, say, the events of feed push-up that occur at different time points across the day. We've actually got some really neat data to support this, very new data that's come from a study that we just conducted in Canada with a number of robotic milking herds, where we were looking at different management practices on these herds and how that influenced different aspects of cow behavior, including the standing and lying patterns of cows, as well as the milking activity patterns of the cows. And in this study, what we found is that the average frequency by which feed was pushed up in these farms was 8 times a day, but it ranged from 2 to 24 times per day. And then when we looked at all these farms and we looked at the association with a number of these behavioral parameters, one really interesting one that we found was that across these herds, we saw that the amount of time that cows spent lying down actually increased with more feed push-ups per day. And so if we think about this, this might actually sound counterintuitive. We might think that if we push up feed more often, we're going to get cows up on their feet and feeding more and actually lying down less. But what we suspect is happening in this case is that by pushing up feed more often, we're actually getting cows to use their time more efficiently. So thinking about that picture I showed you earlier, we don't have cows waiting around doing nothing, waiting for that feed to get to them. Rather, when they are up, when they're stimulated to eat, that feed's available to them, they can eat, and then they can spend the time that they need to lying down, and they don't have to waste a lot of time standing up doing nothing in that situation. So really the benefits of feed push-up are really to ensure that feed is in the bunk when cows go there. And again, I don't really care how that gets done, whether that's manually, whether that's with some type of attachment to a tractor or to a skid steer, or whether it's some kind of automated system that you have in your barn. The message I want to give you is that it just needs to get done so that, again, any time that cows are up, that their feed is available to them. And so the more consistent we can do that, and if it requires automation to ensure that, then that's the route that we need to go. And so it's going to make sure that feed is available to those cows when they're there, and then also it's going to provide a more consistent product in the feed bunk as well, because it's going to help mix up that feed for those cows in the feed bunk as well. The last point that I want to make as part of my presentation here to you this evening is the fact that not only should that feed be available to the cows when they get up to go to the feed bunk, in terms of it's pushed up, it's readily available to them, it's the stuff that we've formulated for them in terms of dietary composition, but we also want to make sure that cows have good access to that feed in terms of minimizing the amount of competition that may exist. And as you see on the screen here, you see cows at the feed bunk squeezing this middle cow out here. And if you watch cows that are group fed long enough, you're going to see this type of behavior occur, where either one or more cows will push and bully individual cows away from the feed bunk. And that effect of competition, largely influenced by stocking density, so the number of cows per available feeding spots, is going to have differential effects on cows across the day and again across even the lactational cycle. What research has told us that the most critical time period is going to be during the transition period. So particularly for our most vulnerable cows, so our cows that are close to calving, so in the couple weeks prior to calving, as well as our fresh cows, so those cows in the first weeks after they've calved out, those cows are going to be the most sensitive to increases in feed bunk competition. And so we have a number of studies that have shown that by increasing the amount of competition available to cows across the day, we're going to potentially, again, in these high vulnerable cows, so again in this transition period around calving, we're going to potentially limit dry matter intake and limit how much feed those animals actually consume. And so this is an example from a Canadian study actually where cows are fed kind of non-competitively in the blue line, which is basically one feeding spot per animal, so about 60 centimeters of feed bunk space per cow, or a more competitive situation where we have only about 30 centimeters of feed bunk space per cow. And so what you see is that particularly during the close-up period, so the weeks before calving, we really limit the amount of dry matter intake that those animals are consuming by introducing that competition for feed access during that time period. And we know that these cows then, and again, in the interest of time, I'm not showing that, but we can discuss these things, is these cows are then at high risk of other problems post-calving, and we have some new data to suggest that when we increase competition during this time period, we limit dry matter intake, then we increase the risk of postpartum diseases, particularly things like ketosis, which again are going to be related to energy intake and energy balance in those cows during that time period, as well as other metabolic and infectious diseases that occur in the early postpartum period. Those are all going to be influenced by things like feeding competition. For our later lactation cows, they actually seem to be, in many cases, quite resilient to, say, increased feeding competition. And so there's actually been a number of studies which have showed that we can overcrowd cows a little bit without having immediate negative impacts on, say, intake levels and production levels. And that's because cows can be pretty resilient in terms of maintaining those intake levels and their production levels. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's not going to have negative consequences, though. And a good example of that, again, is some data that we collected on Canadian dairy farms a few years back. And so in a field study of Canadian dairy farms where we measured the mean available space per cow to be about 56 centimeters per cow, or about 36 to 99 centimeters, kind of in a range available on the farms that we were looking at. So that's, again, about 2 feet of space, so just over 12 inches to almost 36 inches of space per cow. We saw that across that range that we actually saw that associated with differences in not intake levels and not overall milk production, but things related to milk components. So for every 10 centimeter increase in bunk space on these farms, we saw farms having higher milk fat and lower somatic cell counts. And those differences between farms in terms of these milk components, milk fat and somatic cell count, we can probably explain by the impact that competition has on cow eating behavior. So again, if we're forcing cows to have a very limited amount of space available to them, what that's going to do is that's going to force cows to eat their feed very quickly in very large meals, which is going to again have negative impacts on their rumen environment, which again might increase their risk of acidosis and this milk fat depression. So that explains that effect. But we also know that when we increase stocking densities, whether again that's at a lying stall or particularly at a feed bunk area, what happens is that changes the behavioral patterns of the cows as well, so that cows may, when they come back for milking, for example, they may choose to lie down rather than go and feed. And we're particularly interested at that time for cows to stand for a little while, let their teat ends close up, and then actually go lie down after they've been on their feet for, say, 40 to 45 minutes or more, to decrease the risk of them acquiring a new infection because their teat canals are still open. And so that probably explains that somatic cell count difference as well in that scenario. So that gets me to really the end of my presentation, and just a couple take-home messages before we jump into some questions. But what I hope to impress upon you today is the fact that management of the feed bunk is probably just as important as the ration itself. Now again, I don't want to discredit the importance of nutrition and nutritional quality in terms of ensuring cow health and productivity, but how we actually manage that feed and the impact that it has on cow behavior can have just as big of an impact on health and production efficiency in our dairy cows as the diet itself. And really, I guess what I'm a proponent of is really allowing cows to eat when they want and what they need. And the three things that I hoped to have impressed upon you today is is the need to keep feed in front of cows. So again, anytime cows want to eat, that there's feed available to them. Number two, that they're stimulated to feed across the day, so we create enough management events across the day that cows want to eat and get up and go eat. And then number three is that when the cows actually do go and eat, that the feed is available to them and they have good access, so there's nothing hindering their ability to get to that feed when they want to. So with that brings me to the end of my presentation, and I thank you for listening to me this evening, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have at this time.